This morning, I want to speak about toxic masculinity, but I'm aware that not everyone in the room may understand what I mean by that term, toxic masculinity. So let me mansplain it to you. Now, in case you didn't get the memo, mansplaining is when a man explains something to a woman in the most patronizing way possible. Now, if you're new and this is your first time here, I know what you're thinking. Sometime today you're going to say, I went to this church where the minister was mansplaining. And while this is true, let's see if I can hit the reset button, because what I'd really like to do is talk about toxic masculinity without sinking that low or going to that mansplaining place. So one of the ways to begin might be to look at a definition of toxic masculinity found in, let's say, Wikipedia. Toxic masculinity is defined, this is Wikipedia speaking, toxic masculinity is defined by adherence to traditional male gender roles that restrict the kinds of emotions allowable for boys and men to express and limit the emotional expression primarily to feelings of anger. The term toxic masculinity is not meant to be male bashing or man bashing. In fact, I would argue that the idea of toxic masculinity is an effort to describe those societal norms that actually harm young boys or harm men or people who identify in that way, but also harm girls and women, indeed harm people regardless of gender identity. Last week, I was at the Festival of Faiths, which is a large interfaith gathering in Louisville, Kentucky, and the theme for the week was Sacred Insight, Feminine Wisdom. And I heard a very powerful presentation by Lila June Johnston, who's a Native American ecologist, environmental activist from the Dene or Navajo tribe, who also just happens to be a hip-hop artist. After her talk and her musical performance, there was a question and answer session, and someone asked a question from a sincere spiritual place, and I'm paraphrasing it. He said, I'm having difficulty finding a spiritual response to the toxic masculinity that I see coming from the White House in Washington. What is your advice? And I think the answer she gave gives an insight, however you voted, whatever political party you support. Her advice was a good insight for us all. She said, I refer to the president as Uncle Trump. In other words, he's part of the family. Now, note this statement is grounded in a very Navajo sentiment where spirituality is about all our relations, the two-legged, the four-legged, the winged, the finned, all our relations in the broadest possible sense, so that when we're angry about politics, we can reframe it by talking about Uncle Trump or Aunt Hillary or Cousin Bernie or Cousin Mitch, putting it in the context of all our relations. It is this understanding of all our relations that informs how I want to speak about toxic masculinity this morning, because I believe toxic masculinity is toxic to us all, regardless of party, regardless of gender identity, regardless of who we may be. Now, many years ago, I was in seminary, and as part of that experience, I worked as a chaplain in a hospital. And one of the things I learned from that experience is there are a lot of angry men in hospitals. Sometimes it seems like a particularly strong concentration on the children's wing. And my observation was these men were not angry at doctors or nurses or chaplains or anybody else so much as they were angry about being powerless, angry about being helpless, angry about being vulnerable, angry about being sad, angry about being heartbroken or bereft. Now, when I was young, I confess I didn't always understand the anger that I saw or understand what was beneath it. But now, the older I get, the more I understand that feeling angry about powerlessness, feeling angry about vulnerability, feeling angry about helplessness. In this age of reactionary politics, it's so common for anger to meet anger, hate meet hate, argument meet argument. In such an environment, we would be wise to remember the words of the Reverend Bill Sinkford, who taught us that we should look for the hurt beneath the hate. The hurt beneath the hate, the pain beneath the anger, the anxiety behind the argument. This is not to excuse the message or the actions of hate groups. This is not to excuse that. In our state capitol, there is a bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, and that is not acceptable. Indeed, that's complete bullshit in the year 2018. However, there are ways to be in relationship to hate that either disempower it or augment it and strengthen it. And what I want to talk about is how do we move forward in transformational ways that change the situation in meaningful ways. During the civil rights movement, when policemen were unleashing attack dogs on protesters, knocking them down with fire hoses, Dr. King said something that is relevant today. He said, sometimes the disease needs to surface before we find the cure. The disease needs to come out before we can find the cure. And right now, in our time, there is a lot of disease coming to the surface. So much so that I sometimes wonder and despair if there's a way to find a cure for it all. So that's part of that powerlessness that I'm talking about. So one of the challenges I face personally when I'm trying to address the issue of toxic masculinity is how do I respond to an angry white man without becoming an angry white man? How do I do that? The author Salman Rushdie once said, "Be careful when the powerful trample over you, because their disease will infect you through the soles of their feet." Through the soles of their feet. When toxic masculinity tramples over us, we can be contaminated and become toxic ourselves. Whenever I get angry, I like to ask myself the question, is my anger helping me or is it hurting me? Is my anger empowering me to action? Is my anger helping me to make a difference? Is my anger inspiring me to be creative? Or is my own anger my worst enemy? Now, Thursday marked the 20th anniversary of my ordination. The only reason I know that is the little certificate's right by my desk. I looked up last week and said, oh, 20 years. 20 years ago, I made this vow. This was my ordination vow. With humility and reverence, I accept the joys and responsibilities of this most sacred mission, to make my life's work a ministry of reconciliation, a ministry which forever seeks the reconciliation of all people to each other, to the creation which nourishes us, and so many other diverse forms of life, and to the God in whom we live and move and have our being. When I began my ministry, my heroes were and are peacemakers like Lucretia Mott or Mahatma Gandhi, some of the great peacemakers of world history. But lately, and the older I get, the more I identify with those angry men in the hospital. Those angry men in the hospital. In our current cultural conflict, I found myself angry more than I like, more than I think is healthy. And here's why that's an issue for all of us. Anger is an issue for all of us. Anger is a very dangerous emotion for everyone. Anger is connected with high blood pressure, which can lead to heart attacks and strokes, as the story of B. Griffith tells us. Anger is linked to increased levels of anxiety and depression. Anger can shorten our lives. Did you know that anger is associated with reduced lung capacity, which means the angrier we are, the harder it is for us to breathe? That fact gives a whole new meaning to the hymn we sing many Sundays. When I breathe in peace. When I breathe out love. Sometimes we need to let go of our anger simply to be able to breathe. So I began my ministry with a vision of reconciliation, and I am still dedicated to that goal. However, after 20 years, I can still see the faces of people who walked out of the church, people who've left because they didn't like a committee vote, they didn't like a congregational decision, they didn't like a staff judgment call, people who have chosen to sever the bonds of friendship and connection. And for this reason, remembering those vows 20 years ago puts me in touch with my powerlessness and my vulnerability and my limitations. And so I know the meaning of the words we said together in that new member recognition. Blessed are those who know that the church is often imperfect, yet rather than harbor feelings of anger or disappointment, bring their concerns and needs to the attention of church leaders. And I would add, remain committed to transformation. Remain committed to transformation. So before I go any further, let me ask you a question. Are you ready for me to go woo-woo on you? If so, say woo-woo. All right. I was going to do it anyhow, ready or not. Last week I was at the Festival of Fates, immersed in that theme of sacred insight, feminine wisdom. But consciously or unconsciously, I was carrying around the mood of those angry men in the hospital. I went to that conference with that feeling going on, and I carried it with me. It's just kind of diffuse. It's about a lot of things. It's not about one thing. It's just a diffuse feeling. However, on the last day, I went to a gathering that was in a teepee. This teepee is traveling all around the country. It was at Standing Rock. It's part of the Water is Life action there, but it's traveling around for consciousness-raising ceremonies and rituals. And so I was there for a ceremony led by an elder, and as I sat in the circle and went through the smudging ritual, I suddenly felt very close to my mother. My mother had a very close affinity to Native American spirituality. And I have to say that when I do rituals, I don't always feel the power of them, but I was feeling the power that moment. I was feeling the power and the energy in that space. I felt the energy coursing through my body, and these words came to me. These words were, "You're not the one that's angry. It's your mom that's angry." And if you knew my mom, you might know there was something to it. And at that moment, I felt my anger lift and disperse. And it was almost like smoke sort of traveling up through that opening area into the sky. And it was just a release, a sense of freedom, because I'd been carrying it for a while, and so I could tell when it was released. And then after that ritual, after that moment when I felt that release, I heard an elder woman say, "In our tribe, it's the grandmothers who declare war, and apparently also the grandmothers who declare peace." At some point, we left the TP for a drumming circle, a goodbye ceremony where a leader, a woman named Woman Stand Shining, also of the Navajo tribe, was doing a drumming ritual, a goodbye ceremony. And as I left that circle, I got a message on my phone from my son that said, "Be prepared to be wowed." So I was waiting for that because I was ready to be wowed. And all of a sudden, a video came on of my granddaughter, who's almost a year old, but for whom sitting up is an accomplishment. And she was lying on the sort of the carpet with sort of primal noises. And all of a sudden, she sat up, grabbed a bowl, grabbed a spoon, and started beating it like this. So the grandmothers declare peace, and the granddaughter says, "Amen." So today, if I'm a little less angry, a little less like those angry men in the hospital, it's because of that encounter with the sacred feminine. As I said last week, I don't have to be able to explain an experience in order to appreciate it. So I don't have to explain it in order to appreciate it. Such experiences do not solve every problem, do not heal every wound, do not reconcile every conflict, but sometimes they're helpful when we're dealing with Uncle Trump or Aunt Hillary or Cousin Mitch or Cousin Bernie or whoever drives you nuts. You can choose your relative. We can bring our grandmother's wisdom and our granddaughter's energy to the challenge. We saw that a little bit this week when a woman was recognized in the White House for Teacher of the Year, and she just brought letters from her students who are refugees to bring and deliver to the White House. A very powerful act of peace. Spiritual growth is hard work. It is labor. As Woman Stand Shining said last week, she said, "Everyone wants to give birth metaphorically." However, both in the physical and spiritual life, it's painful and tough work. Nevertheless, we are called to do it, for we know that the whole of creation has been moaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time, and we want to be part of that new birth of freedom, that new birth of energy, that new birth of life. So in conclusion, let me say, the next time someone tries to mansplain something to you, and you feel your blood beginning to boil, and you feel your teeth beginning to grind, take a deep breath, be still, and sing, "When I breathe in peace. When I breathe out love." For when we are giving birth, it is very important to pay attention to our breathing.